Nobody talks about the woman who almost gave up on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not a storm rolling in, universe sending signs kind of Tuesday. Just a regular one. Gray sky, cold coffee sitting on the counter since 6 in the morning. A phone that had not buzzed with a single notification all day because there was nobody left to check on her. Her name was Priya Menon, and at 34 years old, she had become the kind of person other people describe with a pause. Oh, Priya? She's doing okay, I think. That pause held everything. The pity, the distance, the quiet agreement among friends and family that Priya had become someone you worried about, but never called. Someone you mentioned in passing, but never invited. Someone who existed in the margins of other people's lives like a footnote nobody bothered to read. This is not a story about a woman who was secretly brilliant and the world just hadn't noticed yet. That would be too clean, too easy. This is a story about a woman who had been ordinary in every measurable way, who had failed in ways that were not cinematic or poetic, but just plain embarrassing, and who did something so unexpected on a Thursday afternoon in March that the people who had written her off could not stop talking about her for months. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the Thursday, there was the Tuesday. And before the Tuesday, there were 34 years of a life that looked, from the outside, like a slow leak. Not a burst pipe, not a flood, just a faucet dripping in the dark. So quiet you only notice the damage when the floor gives way. Priya grew up in a small town called Ramnagar, about 4 hours from any city that mattered. Her father ran a printing press that mostly survived on wedding invitations and government forms. Her mother taught mathematics at the local school and had the kind of quiet authority that made children sit up straight without being told. There were 2 brothers, both older, both louder, both the kind of boys who filled rooms simply by walking into them. Priya filled rooms the way furniture does. Present, functional, unnoticed until someone needed something. She was not a bad student. She was not a good student. She existed in that vast middle territory where report cards said things like consistent and adequate and shows potential, which is the academic equivalent of saying someone has a nice personality. Her brothers brought home trophies, science fairs, debate competitions, cricket tournaments where they hit sixes and got carried on shoulders. Priya brought home report cards that her mother signed without reading because there was never anything alarming or exciting enough to pause over. The family was not cruel to her. That would make this story simpler. They were something worse. They were indifferent, not the cold, deliberate kind of indifference that a person can rage against. The warm, oblivious kind. The kind where everyone loves you, but nobody sees you, and you grow up wondering if maybe you're just not the type of person who gets seen. At 17, Priya decided she wanted to study design. She had been filling notebooks with sketches since she was 12. Not the usual teenage doodles. Detailed, strange, obsessive drawings of buildings that did not exist, rooms that bent in ways rooms should not bend, furniture that looked like it had been dreamed by someone who had never sat in a chair, but understood the concept of sitting. Her art teacher, a tired man named Mr. Kulkarni who had given up on enthusiasm sometime around 2003, once held up one of her sketches in class and said, "This is either very good or very disturbing. I cannot decide which." That was the closest thing to praise Priya had received in 17 years, and she held on to it like a stolen coin. When she told her family she wanted to study design, the conversation lasted approximately 4 minutes. Her father looked up from the newspaper. Her mother put down the serving spoon. Her oldest brother, Ravi, who was halfway through an engineering degree, laughed. Not meanly. Worse. Fondly. The way you laugh at a child who says they want to be an astronaut. Design, her mother repeated, the way one might repeat a word in a foreign language to test how it sounds. There's no money in it, her father said. He did not say this with judgment. He said it the way he might say, "It's raining," a simple observation about the state of the world. She could do commerce, her mother suggested to her father, as if Priya had already left the room. In a way, she had. Priya enrolled in a commerce degree at a college 40 minutes from home by bus. She attended classes. She passed exams. She graduated with marks that were once again consistent and adequate. Her notebooks, however, told a different story. Every margin of every textbook was filled with designs. Lecture halls redesigned with better lighting. The campus cafeteria reimagined with curves instead of corners. Her hostel room sketched and resketched until it looked like something from a magazine that did not exist yet. Nobody saw the notebooks. Priya did not show them because she had learned, without anyone explicitly teaching her, that showing people what you care about most gives them something to dismiss. After graduation, she got a job at an accounting firm in Pune. The firm was called Deshmukh and Associates, and it was exactly as exciting as it sounds. Priya sat in a cubicle that smelled permanently of someone else's lunch and entered numbers into spreadsheets for 9 hours a day. She was by all accounts fine at it. Not exceptional. Not terrible. The kind of employee who gets a meets expectations on every performance review, which is corporate language for we have literally no feelings about you. She stayed for 6 years. 6 years is a long time to be adequate. 6 years is a long time to eat lunch alone at your desk because the other women in the office had formed a group chat you were never added to. 6 years is a long time to take the 7:15 bus every morning and the 6:45 bus every evening, and to mark the passage of time not by achievements or milestones but by the slow, seasonal rotation of which colleague brought biryani on Fridays. During those 6 years, Priya did 2 things that nobody knew about. The first was that she took an online design course. Then another. Then another. She spent her evenings and weekends hunched over a second-hand laptop whose fan sounded like a dying mosquito, teaching herself software with names that sounded like diseases. She watched tutorials. She failed assignments. She resubmitted. She built a portfolio of work that existed entirely on her hard drive, seen by no one, judged by no one, loved by no one except her. The second thing she did was fall in love. His name was Arjun. He worked in the IT department at Deshmukh and Associates and had the kind of easy confidence that comes from being good-looking enough that the world has always been slightly nicer to you than it is to everyone else. He smiled at Priya in the elevator once, and she thought about it for 3 days. He asked her to pass the sugar at the coffee machine, and she replayed the interaction in her head so many times she could have written a screenplay. They started talking, then texting, then having lunch together, which in an Indian office is basically a declaration of romantic intent. Arjun was charming and funny and had a way of making Priya feel like she was the most interesting person in any room, which was intoxicating for someone who had spent her entire life feeling like the least interesting person in every room. They dated for 2 years. Priya told her family. Her mother was cautiously optimistic. Her father asked what Arjun's father did. Her brothers ran what they called background checks, which mostly involved stalking his social media profiles and declaring him decent enough. Arjun proposed on a rainy evening outside a restaurant that Priya had chosen because it had interesting architecture. He got down on one knee in a puddle. She said yes before he finished the question. It was, by any measure, the happiest moment of her life. The engagement lasted 5 months. The end came on a Sunday. Priya arrived at Arjun's apartment unannounced because she had wanted to surprise him with a cake she had baked, which was lopsided and ugly, but made with the kind of desperate love that turns sugar and flour into something almost sacred. She let herself in with the key he had given her. He was on the couch with a woman from marketing named Simran. They were not doing anything. They were just sitting, but the way they were sitting, the way Simran's head rested on his shoulder, the way his hand lay on her knee with the casual ownership of long practice, told Priya everything that words would have taken too long to say. The cake hit the floor. The lopsided, ugly, sacred cake. Arjun stood up. He said her name. He said it the way people say the name of a problem they have been meaning to deal with. Priya did not scream. She did not cry. She did not throw anything or demand explanations or deliver the kind of devastating monologue that women deliver in movies when they catch their partners cheating. She looked at the cake on the floor. She looked at Simran, who had the decency to look mortified. She looked at Arjun, who had his hands out in front of him like a man, trying to calm a dog he's not sure will bite. How long? Priya said. Not a question. A measurement. Priya, listen, how long? 8 months. 8 months of parallel love. 8 months of I'm working late, and my phone died, and you're overthinking things. 8 months during which Priya had been planning a wedding, choosing invitation cards at her father's printing press, and sketching designs for the mandip in the margins of her accounting spreadsheets. She left the apartment. She walked 14 blocks in the rain before she realized she had left her shoes at his door. That was the first time Priya Menon collapsed. Not physically, something structural. Some load-bearing wall inside her that she had not even known was holding weight gave way. And what followed was not a dramatic breakdown, but something quieter and more complete. She stopped sketching. She stopped taking her online courses. She stopped eating lunch at her desk because she stopped eating lunch at all. She went to work and came home and sat in her rented room and stared at the wall with the dedication of someone studying for an exam in a subject that does not exist. Her mother called every Sunday. Priya answered. She said she was fine. Her mother, who had spent 30 years teaching mathematics and understood patterns, heard something in the word fine that worried her, but did not know how to address because the Menon family had never been given the vocabulary for emotional crisis. They had been given the vocabulary for endurance. So Priya endured. 6 months after the breakup, she quit her job. This was not a brave, empowering decision. It was an absence of energy dressed up as a choice. She simply could not sit in that cubicle anymore, could not look at the coffee machine where Arjun had asked her to pass the sugar, could not exist in a building that held the ghost of a version of herself that had been stupid enough to believe she was loved. She moved back to Ramnagar. This was treated by everyone who knew her as confirmation of what they had always suspected. Priya Menon was not cut out for the world. She had tried. She had failed. She had come home. The story was over. Her father gave her a desk at the printing press. It was not a job offer. It was a place to sit. The desk was in the corner, near a window that looked out onto a wall, and Priya sat there for 3 months doing small tasks, proofreading wedding invitations, checking paper orders, answering the phone when her father was busy. She was, once again, furniture. Present. Functional. Unnoticed. Her brothers visited on weekends sometimes. Ravi was now a senior engineer at a firm in Bangalore. The younger one, Nikhil, was doing an MBA and talking about startups with the breathless enthusiasm of someone who had never failed at anything. They were kind to Priya. They brought her sweets and asked how she was doing and told her she looked well even when she did not. They treated her the way you treat a recovering patient, with gentle voices and no sudden movements, and this gentleness, this softness, this absolute absence of expectation was the most devastating thing of all, because it meant they had given up on her. Not in a dramatic way, not with speeches or interventions or tough love. In a quiet way that families give up on the member who has not met the minimum threshold for a life worth worrying about. They had reclassified her. She was no longer Priya who was figuring things out. She was Priya who was back home. And back home was a destination that, in the geography of Indian families, meant the journey was over. Priya knew this. She felt it in the way her mother no longer asked about her plans, in the way her father introduced her to visitors as my daughter who helps at the press, rather than by her name and qualifications, in the way old-school friends, the few who still lived in Ramnagar, looked at her with the particular combination of relief and pity that people feel when someone else's life has gone worse than theirs. She was 33 years old. She had no savings worth mentioning, no relationship, no career, no portfolio because the laptop with her 6 years of design work had been stolen from the bus during her move back to Ramnagar, and she had not backed anything up because she had never believed any of it would matter. She had nothing, and nothing, it turns out, is a very specific kind of starting position. It is not the same as rock bottom, which implies a solid surface to push off from. Nothing is more like floating. No direction, no momentum, no landmarks. Just a woman sitting at a desk near a window that looks out onto a wall, watching the light change and wondering if this is all she was ever going to be. The answer to that question arrived on a Tuesday. It arrived in the form of a phone call from a woman named Kavita Shah, who ran a small nonprofit in Pune that worked with urban slum communities. Kavita was looking for someone to redesign the community center in Dharavi, one of the largest slums in Mumbai. The budget was almost nothing. The timeline was impossible. The previous designer had quit because the project was, in Kavita's words, a beautiful nightmare. Kavita had found Priya's name through a chain of connections so unlikely it sounded invented. A former professor from one of Priya's online courses had mentioned her work to a colleague, who had mentioned it to a friend who happened to be Kavita's sister-in-law. The work they had seen was from Priya's early assignments, things she had submitted 3 years ago and forgotten about, rough and unfinished and deeply strange. I don't want someone polished, Kavita said on the phone. I've had polished. Polish quits when things get hard. I want someone who sees spaces the way you do, like they're alive. Priya sat at her desk near the window. The light was doing its late afternoon thing, going gold at the edges. I don't have a portfolio, she said. My laptop was stolen. I know, Kavita said. I don't care. I haven't designed anything in over a year. I know that too. There was a silence that lasted exactly long enough for Priya to look at the wall outside her window and notice for the first time that a vine had started growing up its surface. A thin green thread pushing through concrete. When do you need me? Priya said. Yesterday, Kavita said. Priya packed a bag that evening. She told her father she was going to Mumbai for a project. He looked up from the newspaper, and for a moment, the expression on his face was identical to the one he had worn when she had told him she wanted to study design at 17. That pause, that quiet, wordless measurement of a daughter he had never quite known how to see. For how long? He asked. I don't know. He nodded. He went back to his newspaper. Her mother, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, said nothing. But she packed extra food for the train, and she packed it in the good container, the stainless steel one that she usually saved for when the boys visited. Priya noticed. She noticed, and she did not say anything about it, because some things between mothers and daughters exist entirely in the language of containers and food and the weight of a bag packed with more care than the occasion seems to require. She left for Mumbai on a Wednesday morning. The train was crowded and hot and smelled like metal and sweat and someone's mango pickle. She sat by the window with her bag on her lap and watched the country scroll past, brown fields and green patches and stations that blurred into one long smear of concrete and color. She had no laptop, no portfolio, no track record, no reputación, no safety net, no plan B. She had a phone call from a stranger who had seen her worst work and wanted her anyway. That was it. That was all she had. And somewhere between Ramnagar and Mumbai, in the space between one station and the next, Priya Menon opened a notebook, a cheap one she had bought at the platform, and started sketching. The first drawing was the community center, not as it was because she had never seen it, as it could be, walls that curved instead of cornered, windows placed not where convention dictated, but where light would fall at the hours when people actually used the space. A courtyard that was not a courtyard, but a gathering, a word she wrote in the margin and circled 3 times because it was the right word and she knew it in her bones. She sketched for 6 hours. She filled the notebook. She started on the back of her train ticket. When the train pulled into Mumbai, the city hit her like a wall of sound and heat and diesel and jasmine and ambition and decay, all of it at once. And she stood on the platform with her bag and her full notebook and her empty everything else, and she did not feel ready. She felt awake. There is a difference between those two things that most people never learn, and the ones who do usually learn it only after everything comfortable has been taken away. Priya walked out of the station and into the city that would, in the coming weeks, either confirm everything everyone had ever believed about her or destroy it so completely that the people who had written her off would have to find new words for what she became. But that part of the story belongs to what happened next. And what happened next started with a door she almost did not knock on. The community center in Dharavi was not a building. It was an apology. Someone years ago had put up 4 concrete walls and a tin roof and called it a service to the poor the way governments do when they want credit without commitment. The walls had been painted once, a sickly green that had since faded into the color of exhaustion. The roof leaked in 6 places. The floor was cracked in a pattern that looked deliberate, like the building itself had tried to split open and crawl away from its own inadequacy. Priya stood in the doorway on her first morning and stared. Kavita Shah stood next to her, arms crossed, watching Priya's face the way a doctor watches a patient's reaction to an X-ray. Kavita was a compact woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair, pulled back, so tight it seemed to be disciplining her skull. She wore cotton kurtas in colors that had no business being that bright, and spoke in sentences that arrived fully formed, no filler words, no hedging, no apology for taking up space. She was the kind of woman who had been underestimated so many times she had stopped keeping count and started keeping score. Well, Kavita said. Priya walked into the center. The main hall was large enough to hold about 60 people, if none of them minded touching shoulders with strangers. There was a stage at one end, a raised platform made of plywood that sagged in the middle like a hammock. Plastic chairs were stacked against the far wall, the kind that exist in every government building in India, and seemed designed to make sitting an act of mild punishment. A single tube light flickered overhead with the commitment of someone who has already decided to quit, but hasn't filed the paperwork. Children's drawings were taped to one wall. They were the best thing in the room. Bright, fearless, gloriously wrong in their proportions. Houses with doors bigger than roofs. Suns with 17 rays going in directions suns do not go. Priya stood in front of them for a long time. The kids use this space? She asked. The kids, the women's group, the health clinic on Tuesdays, the tutoring program, the senior citizens chai circle on Thursday mornings, Kavita said. Everything happens here. Everything fights for the same room. There's only one room. There's only one room. Priya crouched down and touched the floor. The concrete was cold in some places and warm in others, as if the building had a fever it couldn't decide on. She pressed her palm flat against it and stayed there, and Kavita watched without asking why, because Kavita was the rare kind of person who understood that some questions are better answered by silence. What Priya was doing, though she could not have explained it in words that made sense to anyone else, was listening, not to sound, to the space, to the way the walls held the light, to the way the air moved, where it pulled and where it pushed, to the story the room told about the people who used it, the scuff marks on the floor that mapped 1,000 entrances and exits, the wear patterns on the chairs that showed where people prefer to sit, the handprints on the walls at child height that recorded an unofficial census of every kid who had ever run through this room with dirty hands and no intention of slowing down. She stood up. Her knees cracked. She was 34, and her body had started making editorial comments. Can I see the outside? The outside was worse. The community center sat in a narrow lane between 2 larger structures, hemmed in on 3 sides like a middle child between older siblings. The lane was maybe 8 feet wide, crowded with drainage pipes, electrical cables that looped and tangled in patterns that would have given a safety inspector a heart attack, and the constant living traffic of Dharavi itself. People moving, vendors setting up, children weaving through legs, a goat standing in front of a doorway with the calm authority of security guard. The fourth side of the building, the front, opened onto a slightly wider road where an open gutter ran along the edge and motorbikes parked in a line so tight they looked like they were holding hands. There was no sign on the building, no indication that this was a community center, no reason for anyone walking past to stop. Priya stood in the lane and looked up. Between the buildings, a narrow strip of sky was visible, bright blue and impossibly far away, like looking up from the bottom of a well. What's your budget? She asked. Kavita told her. Priya's mouth did something complicated. It wanted to laugh. It wanted to cry. It settled for a shape that was neither. That's not a budget, Priya said. That's a suggestion. Welcome to nonprofits. Priya pulled out her notebook, the cheap one from the train platform, now swollen with 6 hours of sketches that had nothing to do with what she was seeing and everything to do with what she had imagined before reality introduced itself. She flipped to a blank page. She sat down on the ground, cross-legged in the lane, in Dharavi, in the middle of a Tuesday morning, and she started drawing. Kavita watched. A woman carrying a water jug stepped around Priya without breaking stride. Two kids stopped to look over her shoulder, declared her drawing okay with the devastating honesty of children, and moved on. A man on a bicycle rang his bell. Priya did not move. The bicycle went around her the way water goes around a rock, and the man muttered something she did not hear because she was somewhere else, inside the building, inside the problem, inside the impossible distance between what this space was and what it needed to be. She drew for 2 hours. When she stood up, her legs had gone numb, and her back felt like it had been folded incorrectly. She showed Kavita the notebook. The drawing was not a floor plan. It was not an architectural rendering. It was something in between, a feeling translated into lines. The main room had been divided not by walls, but by levels, subtle changes in floor height that created zones without barriers. The stage was gone. In its place was a stepped area, like a small amphitheater, that could serve as a stage, seating, a play area, or a classroom, depending on how the community arranged themselves. The single tube light had been replaced by a series of openings in the roof, carefully angled slots that would pull daylight into the room and move it across the space as the hours changed. So the room itself would shift through the day, bright and open in the morning, warm and intimate by afternoon. The front wall was gone entirely. In its place was a folding system, panels that could open the building completely to the street or close it for privacy. So the community center could breathe, could expand into the lane during festivals and gatherings, could invite the neighborhood in instead of hiding from it. And on the wall where the children's drawings hung, Priya had sketched a surface made of reclaimed materials, textured, touchable, a wall that was not a wall but a canvas, something the community could change and reshape and claim as their own. So the building would never be finished, would always be in the process of becoming. Kavita looked at the notebook for a long time. "Can you do this?" she asked. "Not can you design this. Can you do this?" The distinction mattered. "I don't know," Priya said. "Good answer," Kavita said. The last designer said yes immediately. He lasted 2 weeks. The next 3 months were the hardest of Priya's life, and her life had not exactly been a vacation. The budget was a joke. The timeline was a threat. The logistics of renovating a building in one of the most densely populated neighborhoods on Earth, while it continued to serve a community that depended on it daily, was the kind of problem that made experienced architects pour themselves a drink and call their therapists. Priya was not an experienced architect. She was not any kind of architect. She had an online certification in design thinking, a commerce degree she had never used, and a notebook full of drawings that looked like the fever dreams of someone who had swallowed a geometry textbook. But she had something else, something that nobody, including Priya, had identified or named until Dharavi forced it into the light. She could see people, not in a mystical sense, in a practical one. She could walk into a space and understand within minutes how the people who used that space actually moved, where they gathered, what they avoided, what made them comfortable, and what made them shrink. She had spent her entire life being invisible. And invisibility, it turns out, is a form of observation so pure it borders on a superpower. When nobody is looking at you, you're free to look at everything. She spent the first 2 weeks not designing anything. She sat in the community center during every session. She sat with the women's group and watched how they arranged themselves, always in a circle, always with their backs to the door, always with the youngest women closest to the exit. She sat with the tutoring program and watched how the children fought over the 2 chairs that were near the window, because those chairs had sunlight, and sunlight made homework less terrible. She sat with the senior citizens' chai circle and watch how the old men claimed the same spots every Thursday with the territorial precision of cats, and how the old women sat wherever there was space because they had spent their whole lives sitting wherever there was space. She noticed things nobody asked her to notice. She noticed that the women's group always finished 20 minutes early because the room got too hot in the afternoon and there was no ventilation. She noticed that the tutoring kids drew on the walls when they thought nobody was watching, and that the drawings were better than anything they produced in their official art sessions because the walls gave them permission that paper did not. She noticed that the health clinic always had a line outside the door because people did not want to wait inside, because inside felt like a government office, and government offices felt like places where you want to be told no. She wrote all of this down, not in design language, in people language, in sentences like the grandmothers need a corner that feels like theirs, and the clinic should not feel like a clinic, and the children need walls that say yes. Then she started designing. The problems came fast and heavy and from every direction. The first problem was money. The budget Kavita had quoted was already optimistic, and the actual funds available turned out to be even less because a grant they had been counting on was delayed by bureaucracy, which in India is not a bug but the entire operating system. Priya needed materials. She could not afford materials. She sat in her rented room, a space the size of a generous closet in a building that smelled permanently of frying onions, and stared at her sketches and did the math, and the math did not work. The math was not even in the same neighborhood as working. So she did something that no trained architect would have done, because no trained architect would have been desperate enough or naive enough to try. She went to the community. She walked through Dharavi with Kavita and talked to people. She talked to the man who ran the recycling operation 3 lanes over and had mountains of aluminum and tin that he sorted and sold. She talked to the woman who ran the small-scale textile workshop and had offcuts of fabric in every color that she usually threw away. She talked to the carpenter whose shop was so full of scrap wood that he could not open his back door. She talked to the potter who had cracked tiles stacked in his yard like a ruined mosaic. She told them what she was doing. She showed them her drawings. She asked if they had materials they could spare. Most of them looked at her the way people look at someone who is either very brave or very confused. A few laughed. One man asked if she was from the government, and when she said no, his entire posture changed, his shoulders dropped, his face opened, and he said, "Then, what do you need?" Within 2 weeks, Priya had collected enough scrap material to furnish a small museum of beautiful garbage. Aluminum sheets that could be cut and bent into roof panels. Fabric offcuts that could be stretched over frames to create movable partitions. Scrap wood that could be sanded and joined into the stepped seating area. Cracked tiles that could be broken further and reassembled into mosaic surfaces. She laid all of it out on the floor of the community center one evening after the last session ended, and she sat in the middle of it like a woman sitting in the wreckage of something or the beginning of something, and the two looked exactly the same. The second problem was labor. Priya could design, but she could not build. She did not know how to weld aluminum or frame a partition or level a floor. She needed workers, and workers cost money she did not have. Kavita solved this problem by being Kavita. She put the word out in the community that the center was being renovated and that anyone who wanted to help could come. The response was not overwhelming. It was not a montage of eager volunteers showing up with tools and determination and matching bandanas. 7 people came the first day. 3 of them were teenagers who wanted to skip school. 2 were retired men who wanted something to do. 1 was a woman named Fatima who ran a tailoring shop and wanted to make sure they didn't ruin the walls where my daughter's drawings are. And 1 was a man named Rajan. Rajan was a construction worker. He was in his 50s, short, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same material he spent his life working with, all callus and crack and permanent concrete dust in the creases. He had built half the unauthorized structures in this part of Dharavi, which meant he knew more about practical engineering than most people with degrees. He showed up on the first morning, looked at Priya's drawings, looked at the pile of scrap materials, looked at Priya, and said, "You've never built anything before." It was not a question. "No," Priya said. "These drawings," he said, tapping the notebook. "They make sense in here." He tapped his head. "But buildings are not built in here. They're built with this." He held up his hands. "Can you help me?" Priya asked. Rajan looked at her for a long time. His face did the thing that Indian men's faces do when they're deciding whether to take a woman seriously. That particular calculation that weighs politeness against skepticism, against the ingrained assumption that a woman with a notebook full of drawings is playing at something that grown men do for real. Then, he looked at the drawings again. "This thing," he said, pointing at the angled roof openings. "This will leak. Not if the angle is right." "And you know the right angle?" Priya pulled out her phone and showed him the calculations she had done. Light angles, rain trajectories, drainage patterns. 6 months of obsessive research done in a room above a printing press in a town nobody had heard of, using a phone with a cracked screen and a free engineering app that crashed every 40 minutes. Rajan looked at the calculations. He looked at Priya. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not like a conversion experience, but the way a locked door shifts when the right key enters it, a small internal click. "The angle is almost right," he said. "It needs to be steeper by 3 degrees. "Show me," Priya said. That was the beginning. Rajan became her translator. He took her designs, which lived in the world of imagination and intention, and moved them into the world of concrete and metal and gravity. Where Priya saw curves, Rajan calculated loads. Where Priya imagined light, Rajan figured out how to cut openings without weakening the roof. Where Priya wanted walls that opened, Rajan designed a folding mechanism using reclaimed door hinges and aluminum tracking that he welded himself in the lane outside the center at 6 in the morning while the neighborhood was still waking up. They argued constantly, not fights, conversations that got loud because the distance between what it should feel like and what physics allows is a noisy gap. Priya would sketch something. Rajan would shake his head. Priya would insist. Rajan would explain why the building would fall down. Priya would modify the sketch. Rajan would shake his head less. They would arrive somewhere in the middle, a place that was neither pure vision nor pure engineering, but something better than both. The community watched. At first with curiosity, then with skepticism, then with the particular intensity that people develop when something is being done to a space they consider theirs. Opinions arrived like weather, unsolicited and impossible to stop. The women's group wanted the kitchen area expanded. The tutoring program wanted better lighting. The senior citizens wanted their corner left alone. The health clinic wanted a separate entrance. The teenagers wanted, as teenagers universally want, something that was not what it currently was, though they could not articulate what that something might be. Priya listened to all of it. She took notes. She sketched modifications. She incorporated some suggestions and gently refused others. And the refusals were harder than the incorporations because saying no to a grandmother who wants a wider doorway required a level of diplomatic skill that the United Nations would envy. 1 month in, the renovation was behind schedule over budget and generating complaints from neighboring buildings about the noise. The grant money still had not arrived. Kavita was making phone calls with the barely contained fury of a woman who has been promised things by institutions that specialize in promises. Priya was sleeping 4 hours a night and eating meals that Fatima, the tailoring shop woman, brought her because Fatima had decided that Priya was too thin and too stubborn, and someone needed to make sure she did not collapse before the building did. 2 months in, the floor was done. The step seating area rose in gentle tiers from one end of the room, each level a different height, each made from different reclaimed wood, so the whole thing looked like a geological formation, layers of time visible in the grain and color and texture of the material. When the children saw it for the first time, they climbed it immediately, claiming steps like territories, and the sound they made, that specific pitch of children discovering that a space has been made for them, was the first evidence Priya had that what she was doing might actually work. The roof openings came next. Rajan cut them with the precision of a surgeon and the language of a sailor, swearing at the metal in 3 languages when it did not behave. The first time sunlight came through the angled slots and hit the floor in bright geometric shapes that moved as the morning progressed, Priya stood in the center of the room and watched the light walk across the concrete, and she cried. Not the pretty kind of crying, the kind where your face forgets how to be a face, and your body makes sounds that have nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the overwhelming experience of seeing something you imagined become real. Rajan pretended not to notice. He went outside and welded something that did not need welding. The front wall came down on a Saturday. The whole lane came out to watch. It was an event. Rajan removed the concrete blocks one by one while the neighborhood offered commentary and advice and criticism in a continuous stream of sound that was so dense it became its own kind of music. The folding panels went up in their place, aluminum frames with fabric stretched across them in the textile offcuts that the workshop woman had donated, deep reds and burnt oranges, and a blue so vivid it made the gray concrete around it look embarrassed. When the panels were folded open for the first time, the community center did not end at its walls anymore. It poured into the lane. The lane poured into it. The boundary between inside and outside dissolved, and the space became something it had never been, part of the neighborhood rather than apart from it. An old woman from the chai circle stood at the edge of the open space and said, "It feels like someone opened a window in my chest." Priya wrote that down. The community wall, the last element, was the one Priya cared about most. She built it from the cracked tiles the potter had given her, broken further into small pieces, and reassembled into a surface that was rough and irregular, and beautiful in the way that broken things are beautiful when they're put back together by hands that understand that the cracks are not flaws, but features. She left sections of the wall unfinished, deliberately. Gaps and empty spaces where new tiles could be added, where the community could continue the mosaic, where the wall would never be complete because completeness was not the point. The point was that the wall was alive. The point was that it belonged to everyone. The point was that a building should not be a finished sentence, but an ongoing conversation. The renovation took 3 months and 11 days. It cost less than half of what a professional firm would have charged for the design work alone. It was built almost entirely from materials that would otherwise have been thrown away by people who had never built anything like it before, designed by a woman who had no credentials, no experience, and no reason to believe she could do it except for the fact that she was doing it. When it was finished, Kavita stood in the center of the room during the late afternoon, when the light through the roof slots painted the floor in warm gold, and the fabric panels glowed like stained glass, and the mosaic wall caught the light in 100 fragments, and she said, "This is the most beautiful room in Mumbai." It was not. Mumbai has rooms that cost millions. Rooms designed by people whose names are in magazines. Rooms with materials flown in from Italy and lighting designed by specialists, and furniture that costs more than most families earn in a year. But Kavita was not talking about architecture. She was talking about love. And she was right. Nobody outside of Dharavi knew about any of this. The community center was a local miracle, a small story in a big city, the kind of thing that changes the lives of a few hundred people and never makes the news because news requires scale or tragedy, and this was neither. Priya went back to her rented room. She lay on her thin mattress and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular emptiness that follows completion, that hollow space where purpose used to be. The project was done. The money was gone. She had no next step. She had proven something to herself, but proving something to yourself is a private currency that cannot be deposited in any bank. She called her mother. She told her the project was finished. Her mother said, "That's nice, dear. When are you coming home?" Home. The word sat in her chest like a stone. She was 34. She had just done the best work of her life. And the world had not noticed. This is the part of the story where, in a movie, someone important would walk through the door. A famous architect, a journalist, a wealthy patron who happens to be passing through Dharavi for reasons that make sense in screenplays, but never in life. What actually happened was smaller and stranger and more human than that. What happened was that Fatima, the tailoring shop woman who had been feeding Priya for 3 months, had a daughter named Zara. Zara was 22 and worked as a junior assistant at a design magazine in Mumbai called Spaces. Zara's job was mostly fetching coffee and organizing photo files and being ignored by senior editors who considered her existence a mild inconvenience. She was, in other words, the Priya of her workplace. Zara had visited the community center during the renovation. She had helped her mother carry food to Priya on several occasions. She had watched the building transform. She had, without telling anyone, taken photographs on her phone, dozens of them at different times of day, in different light, from angles that showed the space the way Priya had designed it to be seen. One evening, Zara did something that felt small at the time and only became significant later. She uploaded 3 of her photographs to her personal social media page with a caption that read, "My mother's friend built this from garbage and stubbornness. This isn't a Ravi. This is real." 14 people liked the post. One of them was her senior editor's intern. The intern showed the photographs to the senior editor during a meeting about an upcoming issue themed around design for the other India, which was a phrase that made Priya's skin crawl when she eventually heard it, because India does not have an other. It has a million others, and reducing them to a magazine theme is the kind of thing that make her want to scream into a pillow. But the editor saw the photographs. The editor saw the light through the roof slots. The editor saw the mosaic wall. The editor saw the fabric panels glowing in the afternoon sun. The editor said, "Who did this?" And nobody knew. Nobody knew because Priya had not put her name on anything. She had not documented the project. She had not taken photographs or written case studies or created a portfolio or done any of the things that designers are supposed to do to turn their work into a career. She had done the work and walked away because the work was never for her. It was for the grandmothers who needed a corner, for the children who needed walls that said yes, for the women who needed their backs to the door and an exit nearby. Zara gave the editor Priya's phone number. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon in March. Priya was sitting in her rented room, eating rice from a steel plate, watching a pigeon on her windowsill that had been staring at her with unsettling focus for the past 10 minutes. Her phone buzzed. She did not recognize the number. She almost did not answer because unknown numbers in India usually mean either a scam, a wrong number, or someone trying to sell you a credit card, and she was not in the mood for any of those things. She answered. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Priya put the phone down on the mattress. She looked at the pigeon. The pigeon looked at her. "They want to do a story," she said to the pigeon. The pigeon blinked. "About the center. About the design. About me." The pigeon turned its head in that sharp, mechanical way pigeons do, as if adjusting a satellite dish. "In a magazine," Priya said. "A national magazine." The pigeon flew away. It had heard enough. Priya sat in the silence that followed and felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. It was not happiness. Happiness is a warm, round thing. This was sharp, angular. It had edges. It was the feeling of being seen, and she did not know what to do with it. The magazine sent a photographer named Deepak who wore black turtlenecks in Mumbai heat and spoke about light the way monks speak about God, with reverence and an unsettling level of intimacy. He spent 2 days at the community center taking photographs from angles Priya had not considered, lying on the floor to shoot the roof openings from below, climbing onto a neighbor's terrace to capture the folding panels from above, waiting 3 hours for the afternoon light to hit the mosaic wall at exactly the right moment, because he said, "The wall is performing. I need to catch the right act." Priya stood in the corner and watched him work and felt this strange dislocation of seeing her own creation through someone else's eyes. The community center she had built was the same room she had spent 3 months sweating and crying and arguing in, but through Deepak's camera, it became something else. It became evidence, proof that what she had done was not a fluke or a fever dream or the lucky outcome of desperation. It was design, real design, the kind that a man in a black turtleneck would lie on a dirty floor to photograph. The editor came on the second day. Her name was Meera Kapoor, and she was the kind of woman who wore her intelligence like expensive perfume, present in every room before she was. She walked through the community center with her hands behind her back and her mouth set in a line that gave nothing away, and Priya followed her the way a student follows a teacher through an exam, watching for signals that were not coming. Mira stopped at the mosaic wall. She touched it. Her fingers traced the edges of a cracked tile that had been placed at the center of a spiral pattern. A single blue piece surrounded by brown and red, and Priya wanted to tell her that the blue tile had been placed there by Fatima's youngest child, a 5-year-old boy named Amir, who had insisted that the middle needed to be sky color, and had thrown a tantrum of such operatic proportions that Priya had given in because she was too exhausted to argue with a child who understood color. Theory better than she did. She did not tell Mira this. She stood still and said nothing because she had learned from a lifetime of being invisible that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room is take up as little space as possible and let the work speak. Mira turned to her. How did you learn to do this? Priya thought about the question. She thought about 6 years of online courses in a cubicle that smelled like someone else's lunch. She thought about notebooks filled in margins while lectures on accounting droned on. She thought about a stolen laptop and a lost portfolio and a train ride with a cheap notebook. She thought about Rajan and his 3-degree correction and Fatima's food and Amir's blue tile and every person in Dharavi who had given her scrap material and labor and trust, which is the most expensive material of all. I didn't learn, Priya said. I just finally got a room to try in. Mira looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than comfortable. That's your headline, Mira said. The article came out 6 weeks later. Priya did not see it immediately because she did not subscribe to the magazine, and the single copy that Kavita bought and brought to her rented room sat on the floor unopened for 2 days because Priya was terrified. Not of what it said, of what it meant, of the door it might open or might not, of the possibility that she would read it and it would be real and she would have to become the kind of person who has been in a magazine, which is a very different kind of person from the one who eats rice alone in a rented room and talks to pigeons. She opened it on a Friday evening with the solemnity of someone defusing a bomb. The article was 4 pages. The photographs were stunning, the kind that make you stop turning pages and just look. The roof light falling on the stepped seating looked like something from a gallery. The mosaic wall, shot in the late afternoon, glowed with the warmth of 100 different fires. The folding panels, open to the lane, showed children pouring in and out of the space with the chaotic joy of water finding its level. The text was generous, but not sentimental. Mira had written about the design with technical precision and about Priya with the kind of restrained curiosity that comes from a journalist who senses a bigger story than the one she is telling. She described Priya as a designer without credentials, portfolio, or precedent, and the community center as a building that was not designed for people, but with them by someone who understood the difference. The article mentioned the scrap materials, the zero-budget approach, the community involvement, the fact that Priya had no formal training. It did not mention the printing press, the accounting firm, Arjun, the broken engagement, the months of paralysis, the family that had reclassified her. It did not mention any of the wreckage because Priya had not told Mira about the wreckage. She had told her about the building. The article went online. It was shared. It was shared again. It accumulated the kind of slow, organic attention that happens when something real moves through the internet without the engine of celebrity or scandal or manufactured outrage behind it. People shared it because the photographs were beautiful, because the story was unlikely, because there is a hunger, vast and permanent, for evidence that a person with nothing can make something that matters. Priya's phone started ringing. Not with calls from magazines or architects or investors. With calls from people like Kavita, people who ran small organizations in small places with small budgets and enormous needs. A women's cooperative in Kolkata that wanted to redesign their workshop space. A school in rural Rajasthan that needed a library built from locally available materials. A community health center in Chennai that wanted to feel less like a hospital and more like a home. They called because they had seen the article and recognized something in it that had nothing to do with design and everything to do with understanding. They called because Priya's work did not look like the work of someone who had studied design at a prestigious school and arrived with theories and expensive software. It looked like the work of someone who had sat on the floor and listened. Priya said yes to the first call, then the second, then the third. She did not plan this. She did not sit down and develop a business strategy or write a mission statement or create a brand. She just kept saying yes because saying yes was the only thing that felt real, and because each project was another room, another space, another chance to do the thing she had discovered she could do, which was to see people and build the space around what she saw. The Kolkata project was a textile workshop. 40 women working in a room that had been designed. If the word designed can be used this loosely by someone who had never watched anyone weave. The workstations were arranged in rows facing the same direction, like a classroom, which meant the women could not see each other while they worked, could not talk without twisting in their seats, could not share the small social moments that make repetitive labor bearable. Priya rearranged the room into clusters, small groups facing each other, shared work tables with storage underneath, a central area that was not for work, but for tea and gossip and the kind of daily communion that keeps women sane in conditions designed to drive them otherwise. The cost of the renovation was almost nothing. She moved furniture. She added shelves made from reclaimed packing crates. She hung fabric panels between clusters so each group had visual privacy without acoustic isolation. She painted the ceiling, which had been institutional gray, a deep warm yellow that changed the entire feeling of the room the way a single chord change can alter a whole song. The women did not know what had changed exactly. They could not point to any single modification and say that is what is different. But their productivity increased. Their absenteeism dropped. They started staying after hours, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because the room had become a place they chose rather than a place they endured. The Rajasthan project was harder. A school in a village so remote that the nearest paved road was 20 kilometers away and the nearest architect was in another state. The library needed to be built from mud and local stone because nothing else was available or affordable. Priya had never worked with mud. She had never worked with stone. She had never been to Rajasthan. She went. She spent a week in the village. She slept on a charpoy in the headmaster's house and ate meals cooked by his wife, a woman named Sunita who was suspicious of city people in general and city women in particular, and expressed this suspicion through aggressive hospitality, piling Priya's plate with so much food that refusing seconds became a full-time diplomatic mission. Priya walked the village. She sat with the children. She asked them what they wanted in a library and received answers that ranged from practical books to ambitious, a rocket ship, to heartbreaking, a room where it's quiet. She sat with the teachers. She sat with the parents. She sat with the village elders, men with weathered faces who had seen enough government projects come and go that they viewed any outsider with a notebook with the same enthusiasm one might view a traveling salesman selling invisible goods. She won them over not with drawings, but with questions. Specific questions. Questions that showed she had been paying attention. Why is the school entrance on the east side when the children all come from the west? Why are the windows on the wall that gets the most sun when the opposite wall gets the best breeze? Why does the largest classroom have the worst light? These questions, simple as they were, had never been asked. Nobody had ever asked them because nobody who designs buildings for remote villages had ever sat in those buildings long enough to notice the problems. The buildings were designed in offices far away by people who had never met the children who would use them, and this distance, this gap between designer and user was the source of 1,000 small daily failures that accumulated into a pervasive feeling of wrongness, of spaces that worked against the people inside them rather than for them. Priya designed the library with the village. Not for them, with them. The walls were built by local masons using techniques they already knew, mud and stone construction that had been used in the region for centuries. Priya's contribution was in the shape, the proportions, the placement. She designed the building to catch the prevailing wind through narrow openings that created natural ventilation. She designed the roof with a slight curve that directed rainwater into a collection system. She designed the reading areas in a series of alcoves, small semi-private spaces carved into the thick mud walls, each one big enough for 2 or 3 children, each one oriented toward a different view, the fields, the hills, the sky, so that reading became not just an intellectual activity, but a sensory one, books and breeze and the smell of earth and the long golden light of the Rajasthan afternoon. The library took 4 months to build. It cost less than a new car. It was the most beautiful building in the village, which is not a high bar, but the gap between what was there before and what Priya built was so vast that the headmaster, a serious man who had been teaching for 30 years and had long since lost the capacity for surprise, stood in the doorway on the day it was finished and was unable to speak for several minutes. Sunita, the headmaster's wife, brought Priya extra food that evening. She did not say anything about the building. She did not need to. The extra roti said everything. Priya did not become famous. That is not how the story goes, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. What she became was something harder to name and more useful than fame. She became known in specific circles, known among the people who do the unglamorous work of building spaces for communities that the mainstream design world does not consider worth designing for. Known as the woman you call when the budget is nothing and the need is everything, and you want someone who will sit on the floor and listen before she picks up a pencil. Over the next 2 years, she completed 11 projects, each one small, each one in a place that most designers would never go. A community kitchen in a fishing village in Kerala, a meeting hall for a farmers' cooperative in Maharashtra, a shelter for street children in Hyderabad, a craft center for disabled artisans in Madhya Pradesh. Each project taught her something. The Kerala kitchen taught her about humidity and how it changes the behavior of materials and people. The Maharashtra Hall taught her about acoustics and how a farmers' cooperative needs to be able to argue loudly without the sound carrying to the street. The Hyderabad shelter taught her about safety and how children who have lived on the streets need exits they can see from every point in a room, because an enclosed space without visible escape routes is not shelter, but a trap. The Madhya Pradesh Craft Center taught her about accessibility and how a wheelchair is not the only measure of disability and a ramp is not the only measure of access. She never hired employees. She could not afford them. She worked with local builders at every site, people like Rajan who knew the materials and the methods and the land in ways that no outsider could learn from books. She paid herself barely enough to cover rent and food. She did not own a car. She traveled by train, always by train, in the same class she had taken from Ramnagar to Mumbai that first time, sitting by the window with a notebook, sketching buildings that did not exist yet in town she had not arrived at. She was, by any conventional measure, not successful. She had no office, no website, no team, no savings, no awards, no professional accreditation. The design world, the one that gives prizes and publishes coffee table books and invites people to speak at conferences in European cities, did not know she existed. But the people she built for knew. They knew because their rooms were different, because the light fell differently, because the walls felt different, because the spaces she created had a quality that is impossible to photograph and difficult to describe, but immediately recognizable when you walk into it. The quality of having been made by someone who understood that a room is not a container, but a relationship between the people inside it and the world outside. The call came on a morning in October, 2 years and 3 months after the Dharavi project. Priya was on a train to Bhopal for a new project, a community library for a women's literacy program. Her phone rang. She answered it with one hand, while holding her notebook open with the other, mid-sketch, her mind already in the Bhopal building. The woman on the phone introduced herself as the coordinator for a design conference in Copenhagen, an international conference, the kind that gathers architects and designers from 40 countries and puts them on stages with good lighting and simultaneous translation. They wanted Priya to speak. Priya laughed. It was the kind of laugh that happens before the brain has time to decide if something is funny or terrifying a reflex, a sound with no thought behind it. You want me to speak, she said, at a conference in Denmark. Your work was submitted by Kavita Shah, the coordinator said. The jury reviewed your projects. They were unanimous. Priya looked out the train window. India was scrolling past the way it always did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful and broken and hers. I don't have a presentation, she said. I don't have slides or a portfolio or a website. We've seen your buildings, the coordinator said. Bring photographs. Tell us what you told the communities you built for. I told them I didn't know what I was doing. Tell us that too. Priya sat with the phone against her ear and felt the train vibrate through her body, that low, persistent hum that becomes invisible after an hour but never actually stops, the frequency of movement, of going somewhere, of not staying still. Okay, she said. She hung up and sat in the silence and looked at her notebook. The Bhopal library was half-drawn. The lines were still uncertain, still searching, still in that early stage where a design is not yet a design, but a conversation between what is and what could be. She picked up her pencil and kept drawing. The conference was in December. Priya had never been on a plane. She had never left India. She had never owned a passport until Kavita dragged her to the passport office and stood over her while she filled out the forms, because Priya had a tendency to treat paperwork the way some people treat medical appointments, as something to be avoided until the symptoms become life-threatening. She flew to Copenhagen on a Thursday. The plane took off, and Priya pressed her face to the window and watched the ground fall away and the clouds come up and the world become small. And she thought about the view from the lane into Ravi, that narrow strip of sky between buildings, and how it was the same sky but seen from the bottom instead of the top, and how both views were true. Copenhagen was cold in a way that Priya's body did not understand. She had brought a jacket. The jacket was a suggestion. The cold was a command. She walked from the airport to the taxi stand with her teeth clenched so tight her jaw ached, and she got into the taxi, and the driver, a cheerful man with a beard the color of winter, said something in Danish that she did not understand, and then switched to English and said first time, and Priya said first time everything. The conference was held in a building that looked like the future had arrived early and decided to furnish itself in pale wood and glass. There were 800 attendees. Architects from Japan, designers from Brazil, urban planners from Kenya, material scientists from Germany, people with titles and credentials and publications, and the easy confidence of professionals who have spent their careers in rooms designed to make them feel important. Priya was scheduled to speak on the second day. She spent the first day sitting in the back of the auditorium watching the other speakers and feeling the particular terror of someone who has been invited to a party where everyone else knows the choreography and she does not even know the song. She called Kavita that evening from her hotel room. I can't do this, she said. You designed a community center from garbage in Ravi, Kavita said. You built a library from mud in Rajasthan. You rearranged a textile workshop in Kolkata with your bare hands. You can stand on a stage for 30 minutes. These people have PhDs. These people have PhDs and buildings nobody lives in. You have buildings that smell like cooking and sound like children. Go tell them about that. Priya stood on the stage the next morning. The auditorium was half full, which meant 400 people were looking at her, and 400 people is a number that the human brain is not designed to process without producing either fight or flight. And Priya's brain, caught between the two, chose a third option, which was to go very still. She stood at the podium. The lights were warm. The microphone was the kind that clips to your collar and makes you feel like a news anchor. A screen behind her showed the first photograph. The community center in Dharavi, the folding panels open to the lane, children spilling in and out of the frame like light. She had prepared a speech. She had written it on the train to Bhopal and revised it in her rented room and printed it at an internet cafe and carried it in her bag across 2 continents. It was a good speech. It talked about community-driven design, about material reuse, about the philosophy of building with rather than for. It used words like participatory and sustainable and vernacular. It was the kind of speech that a designer gives at a conference. Professional. Polished. Correct. Priya looked at the speech. She looked at the audience. She looked at the photograph of the community center on the screen behind her. She put the speech down. 3 years ago, she said, I was living above my father's printing press in a town nobody here has heard of. I had no job, no money, no portfolio, no laptop, no plan. I had been left by a man I loved, failed at a career I hated, and returned home to a family that had stopped expecting anything from me. My mother packed my lunch in the good container, and I knew, from the way she packed it, that she thought I was never leaving again. The room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next slide. The real quiet. The quiet that happens when someone says something true and 400 people recognize it at the same time. I'm not standing here because I'm talented, Priya said. I am standing here because a woman named Kavita called me and told me she didn't care that I had no portfolio. Because a construction worker named Rajan corrected my angles by 3 degrees and saved the roof from leaking. Because a woman named Fatima fed me for 3 months because she thought I was too thin. Because a 5-year-old boy named Amir put a blue tile in the center of a wall, and he was right. Because a tailor's daughter took photographs on her phone and posted them with a caption that called my stubbornness by its name. She paused. She took a breath. Every building I have made was made by the people who use it. I just held the pencil. That is not modesty. That is architecture. Real architecture. The kind where the building belongs to the people inside it, not to the person who drew it. She showed them the photographs. Not as a presentation. As a story. The Dharavi Center with its broken tiles and moving light. The Kolkata workshop with its yellow ceiling and clusters of women leaning toward each other. The Rajasthan library with its mud walls and reading alcoves and the long golden light that poured through openings designed to catch the wind. The Hyderabad shelter with its visible exits. The Madhya Pradesh craft center with its ramps and wide doorways and the quiet, radical dignity of a space designed for bodies that the world was not designed for. She talked for 42 minutes, 12 minutes longer than her allotted time. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked at their phones. Nobody shifted in their seats. When she finished, the silence lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a long time in a room with 400 people. Long enough for Priya to think, with the calm certainty of someone who has been wrong before, that she had made a terrible mistake. Then the applause started. It was not polite applause. It was the kind that starts in one place and spreads like fire, the kind that has a physical weight, the kind that hits the person standing on stage like a wave, and Priya stood there and received it the way someone receives a downpour after a long drought, with her whole body, eyes closed, hands at her sides, and the feeling, that sharp, angular feeling she had first felt in her rented room in a magazine called That Feeling of Being Seen, filled her up from the floor of her shoes to the top of her head and kept going. After the talk, people came up to her. Not the polite, networking kind of approach where people exchange business cards and promise to email. The real kind. A woman from South Africa who worked in township housing held both of Priya's hands and said, "You just described my entire career in 40 minutes." A man from Japan who designed disaster relief shelters bowed and said, "Your buildings breathe. Mine do not. I want to learn." A young student from Brazil with tears on her face said, "I was going to quit. I am not going to quit." Priya did not have business cards. She wrote her phone number on pieces of paper torn from her notebook. The same notebook she had bought at a train platform 3 years ago, now fat with sketches and notes and the accumulated evidence of a life that had refused to stay written off. Priya flew home. The plane descended through clouds, and India appeared below, brown and green and enormous, and she pressed her face to the window the way she had on the way out, and she thought about walls. The wall of the community center, the wall of Rajan's welding, the wall of her mother's kitchen, the wall outside her father's printing press where a vine had pushed through concrete, the wall she had been for 33 years, present, functional, unnoticed, and the moment she had stopped being a wall and started building them. She landed. She took a train. She went home. Not to the rented room. Home. Ramnagar. Her mother was in the kitchen. Her father was at the press. Everything was the same as it had been 3 years ago when she had left with a bag and a notebook and nothing else. About seeing something you have been waiting to see for a very long time without knowing you were waiting. Are you hungry? Her mother asked. Always, Priya said. Her mother went to the cabinet. She took out the good container, the stainless steel one. She filled it, and this time, the way she filled it was different. Not the filling of provision, not the filling of duty, the filling of celebration, quiet, Indian expressed in rice and dal, and the exact amount of pickle that says, I know who you are and I am proud. Priya sat at the table and ate. Her father came in from the press. He sat across from her. He did not say anything about Copenhagen. He did not ask about the conference or the applause or the architect from 40 countries. He looked at her the way he looked at a well-printed page, with the satisfaction of a man who recognizes quality when he sees it, even if he cannot explain in words what makes it good. There's a building in town, he said. The old community hall, near the market. They want to tear it down. Priya looked up from her plate. It's been empty for years, her father continued, folding his newspaper with the deliberate care he applied to everything. The municipality doesn't know what to do with it. He said nothing else. He went back to his paper. But the information sat between them on the table like a gift that had been placed there casually, without wrapping, without fanfare, the way fathers give things when they do not have the vocabulary for what they are really giving. Priya finished her rice. She washed her plate. She walked to the printing press. She sat down at her desk in the corner, the desk near the window that looked out onto the wall where the vine had grown thicker now, pushing through cracks, finding light, refusing, absolutely refusing, to stop. She opened her notebook. She started to draw. Nobody had written her off anymore. And the people who had once called her dead weight would spend years trying to figure out when exactly she had changed, at what precise moment the woman they had dismissed had become the woman they could not stop talking about. They would never find it, because there was no single moment. There was a vine, and a wall, and a crack, and the slow, stubborn, unglamorous process of pushing through. There was a phone call from a stranger, and a train ride with a cheap notebook, and a construction worker who corrected her angles, and a woman who fed her, and a child who chose the right color, and a mother who packed the good container. There was a woman who sat on floors and listened. That was all. That was everything.